All right, welcome back to the Weekend Debrief. It's our first episode of 2021, and it really just feels like 2020.5. We have a lot to talk about this week. I'm Josh Durso, joined in studio by Ted Baker. He's the host of Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. Ted, how are you? Welcome back.
Good to be here. I thought this was going to be the good year. I thought 2021 was going to be all the things 2020 wasn't.
I thought it was at least going to be better. I thought we were going to get marginal improvement. But we didn't, and here we are, and it has been a really bizarre week here in the United States overall. I guess I'm curious, before we start getting into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to talk about today. When something like this happens, what's it like going on the radio every morning and doing the news? Do you try to maintain some sense of normalcy in what you're doing, or does it feel as tremendously bizarre as it looks from the outside?
It does at times. I'm a pretty low-key, even-keel kind of person, so, stuff doesn't really get to me a lot. So I guess I have kind of a detached viewpoint. Mm-hmm. I don't get emotionally involved in what happened at the Capitol. I say, geez, this is terrible. And also, the day after that, I made a point, because I generally kind of lean left and my co-host kind of leans right, and sometimes we get into it pretty good. So I kind of made a point to sort of stay fact-based, not get real opinionated. And even today we said, let's let this stuff all play out, investigation into the Capitol Police, all that kind of thing. Let's gather a few facts, let's be calm, and then we can start to have our opinions about it at some point.
Yeah, and it's really challenging, and a lot of what we're going to be talking about today are basically some of the questions that have popped up and some of the things that we've been thinking about as we've been covering what's been happening. In particular, the quote-unquote local reaction, what reps have been saying, and it's unusual, but we've got this baseline, right, of misinformation, and you and I talked about it this morning on your show. We live in a world right now where there is just a lot of misinformation and untruth out there. And at the end of the day, the big question for me at this point, we'll talk more about it later, but will the facts matter? Will what we learn about Capitol Police matter? Or will there be an investigation and two outcomes, or two opinions of those outcomes? And, I think we're kind of, in some ways, we're trapped in this back and forth. It's like watching a game of ping pong or something, where we're just going back and forth over and over and over again. I would like to hope, though, that what we lived through this past week, watching, frankly, the United States come as close to utter catastrophe on the global scene as it possibly could. I hope this is a moment of change for everybody across the board. We are going to be talking in a second about some of the COVID stuff that's popped up, some of the COVID headlines that have popped up over the last 5 days. Obviously, with what happened in D.C., it seemed like we got a little more of a quiet Cuomo administration in the second half of the week. But just a couple quick programming notes on our side of Finger Lakes One. We're launching a new newsletter this weekend, Capital Connection. No coincidence to connected to what happened this week. Literally, just this is something that our reporter based down in D.C., who's in grad school, has been working on this for like a month, and he's finally now to the finish line on where we can actually launch it. So that'll be launching on Saturdays. We're relaunching the Sunday Conversation podcast, so we're bringing that back. We've been focusing a lot on short conversations and quick consumable content. We're going to continue doing that, but what we're changing up is running one interesting long-form conversation per week, because we've still been getting interest from different folks who want to see the full versions of our conversations, or just want to see long-form stuff once in a while. My In Focus column in the Finger Lakes Times is done. That's over. That ended in the end of December. December 29th was that was the last piece that ran. My editor's note here on FingerLakes1.com every Sunday is still running. Will continue to running. No changes here on the Weekend Debrief. We're going to keep coming back every week and either pestering or doing things that you love. We'll keep doing it regardless. And then, of course, for those who have been asking, we don't have a link yet on our homepage to sign up for the newsletters that we've been launching. Obviously, we have the Monday through Friday newsletter, which is just your morning rundown of the headlines, and then the Capital Connection on Saturday now, and the Sunday Insight on Sunday. FingerLakes1.com/newsletter is where you can sign up. It was about as simple as I could possibly make it, given the circumstances. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, COVID, hospitals, vaccines, and we featured a conversation. Actually, we published them today. Two parts of a conversation, I should say, with Bill Hammond of the Empire Center. And interesting because he has been doing a ton of reporting. Obviously, he is the individual who's been pushing the FOIL request involving nursing homes, which everyone has been eagerly waiting to see how that plays out. He has requested full data from the State Department of Health, which they've acknowledged exists, but they have come up with a number of different reasons why they can't produce the data. Some estimates indicate that the death toll in nursing homes could be like twice what is actually being reported. So we could have, instead of like 7,000 deaths connected to COVID in nursing homes, it might be more like 14,000. But also, he's been coming up with some really interesting projections on vaccine rollout and how slow it's going. And it's interesting. He's a great follow on Twitter, because every day, as the governor and the Cuomo administration in general pushes out the latest news on what, how many vaccines have been actually given, or how many doses have actually been given, he sort of produces the immediate counterpoint to that, which is, okay, here's what the state says they have done. Here's how long it's going to take given the actual rate that they have produced to date. So interesting stuff there. You mentioned this morning when I talked to you on your show that the governor called out Clifton Springs by name. He called out a ton of hospitals, and he called out hospital systems. And walk me through what your thinking was as you continue to hear sort of these hospitals and healthcare facilities that frankly shouldn't even be in the vaccine distribution game to begin with, just getting raked over the coals over it.
Well, I just don't understand what the governor hopes to accomplish. I mean, are you going to shame Clifton Springs into suddenly distributing the vaccine more quickly? A better thing would be to find out why they aren't, or why they haven't been able to. Maybe half their nurses are homesick with COVID themselves and they can't come in to do it. I don't know the answers to these things. It just seems like that, the governor really over the last few weeks has turned into the statewide daddy. Telling people in the Finger Lakes, and again, I always point out when the state says Finger Lakes, they mean Monroe County, because Monroe County's population is 770,000. The actual Finger Lakes are about 300,000. Telling us it's our behavior. The reason that we're at 10% and Manhattan is at 3 or something is because apparently we're behaving badly. While Manhattanites are all wearing their masks and staying in their pods, we're just out having large lawn parties in the snowbank, I guess. I just don't get any of it. Let's find out why it isn't getting out faster and take whatever steps are needed to get it out faster. It seems like a lot of people would rather grumble about what's not happening than roll up their sleeves and figure out why it's not happening and get it happening.
The thing that I don't understand is why every time we hear about vaccine rollout and we hear about the state's plan and we hear about the different entities and organizations that are going to be involved in distribution of vaccine to the public, why is it that health departments, county health departments, are a footnote? Why are they the last ones mentioned? Why are they seemingly the last ones anyone is thinking about? these departments have mass vaccination plans. And I hate to be a buzzkill to the governor's rep who said that if they empowered counties to do this themselves, he made the argument that there would be 63 or 62, whatever, different plans rolled out in the state for vaccination. That is literally the opposite of how anyone who's watched municipal government, especially in rural communities, play out in the last 5 years. No one is reinventing. None of these small rural health departments have the manpower to reinvent the wheel. None of them are looking to create their own cool plan for vaccinating the public. But what they do have are plans that are incredibly similar because the funding that they've used historically to create these plans either require a lot of sort of similarities or checks and balances, or is just easier for them to effectively create plans that look like their neighbors and that look like other counties across the state. I don't understand what the gain was. So I see a lot of people suggesting that there was some sort of insidious goal here. I don't know what that would be, to give all of this power and authority to regional healthcare systems, to then literally within a week of giving them that authority, just destroy them for not doing it well enough. I don't know what the governor gains. The healthcare systems don't gain anything. No one gains anything. So I don't know what, to the people who are pointing to, basically, I don't want to call it a conspiracy theory, but they're pointing the idea that, this was the governor in some way trying to take control or I don't even understand how that is happening here either. This just seems completely uncontrolled. It seems like chaos. And it's not working. It's obviously not working.
I think the governor's hope was that his plan would work and he would get credit. And if you like Andrew Cuomo, then turn off your computer, because here I go again. Everything he's done during this whole pandemic has been self-serving. He takes credit anywhere he can and deflects blame anywhere he can. I mean, this is the nursing homes all over again. Every single year, for how many decades now have we been vaccinating against flu? Every year. So why didn't these doses just go to CVS warehouses and Rite Aid and Walmart pharmacies and Wegmans pharmacies? The same way we have this system in place that apparently works. There hasn't been a global flu pandemic I'm aware of, but we have to do it a whole different way with the governor in charge. And now suddenly, I mean, not only did the hospitals have to do the distribution, but they had to come up with these big draconian reports and plans. And, all of a sudden I'm the CEO of a health system, and on a Sunday night it gets dropped into my lap that by Tuesday morning I have to have a 100-page plan in place that we know no one's going to read. It just seems like that the health people haven't been front and center. And I know you're going to talk about your experience a little bit, and I was telling you that I saw on Evan Dawson's show on public radio the experience a New Zealand native had who was in Rochester and returned to New Zealand, and how they quarantined and how serious they were. And then I looked up and I saw another article about how they handled it in New Zealand, and it involved a lot of coordination with, surprisingly enough, the regional health entities. They did it there exactly like what you're talking about, and it's worked. They have not had a single case, I'm not talking death, they have not had a case of community transmission since November. Now, much smaller nation, population 5 million, but still 5 million, that's half the population of New York City. Imagine if we could have 2 cases a day or week or something in New York City. So I think one of the biggest lessons in the United States, and specifically in New York, is do not let politicians take the lead in public health administration. Let the public health experts do it.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, maybe one of the only arguments that could be made, and this was one of the things that Bill Hammond, when we talked to him a few days ago, brought up, is that perhaps when the governor made the promise that this vaccine rollout would be the most equitable in the country, that perhaps because of the infrastructure or lack of infrastructure in a lot of communities, especially those that are underserved, it was a bit too much of a promise, and that it created a system where just getting the vaccine into people's arms, period, became a very heavy lift. And, if that is the case, I think going back to what he said, if that is actually what has happened to date, and we've seen a lot more of the I'll call it the different marketing pieces from the state coming out to the health departments, and the health departments pushing them back out, explaining what 1A, 1B, what these different tiers mean and everything else like that. It's starting to make me wonder that if we shouldn't have just gone with an age breakdown, an age process, which is what he proposed. He said, given the fact that some communities, and there is to some degree going to be waste of vaccine where you're going to have doses of the vaccine go bad because the system's just too complicated. When you just need to get people vaccinated and you're in a public health crisis and you lack the actual infrastructure to make sure that it is truly, truly equitable for everyone, maybe starting with something using, for example, birth year as a process would have just been a lot easier. And maybe it's time at some point here to just throw the state plan to the wind, so to speak, and for Albany to say, okay, we're just going to roll it out like this. There's clearly enough supply at this point to at least get healthcare workers and those types of folks vaccinated. But, as someone who is I'm engaged to a healthcare worker, and she was told, as the governor's been saying over and over again, that healthcare workers can get vaccinated. Healthcare workers can get vaccinated. She was being told by her employer that it was going to be at least a month, and that because of what she did in every position in the facility had a different classification of when the company was going to vaccinate them, and it was like you had a plan within a plan, and it's just. And interestingly enough, inside baseball, I suppose, to some degree, but at least in our situation, for those who don't know, she tested positive for COVID. I had to isolate along with her because that's how it works. They are being told, or they have been told, that if you once you test positive, it really isn't a great idea to get the vaccine within 3 months. And before that moment, I had never heard that at all. And I'm sitting here and I'm consuming these coronavirus headlines every day. And I never heard that. And it almost boggled my mind that we have this new piece of information about who, what I would assume to be is given the number of people who have had the virus, we're talking about a large subset of the population who shouldn't be inoculated, I suppose, within the first 3 months of them getting the virus.
Well, that's always...
Where has that information been? And that is not to plant doubt about the vaccine. The vaccine is safe. There have been over 2 million doses issued and like 13 or 20, I can't remember which it was, but either 13 or 20 allergic reactions according to the most recent data, and none of them were severe. They were very simple reactions.
Generally, over the years, the assumption has been, and there's been some discussion about it with COVID, but the assumption is generally that when you get an infection like this, you are then immune from getting it again. To go back to what you're talking about, there's two aspects to the plan. Number one, we've been hearing for 10 months now that our hospitals are overwhelmed. Why would you tell a group of people who are overwhelmed, here's something new you have to do, vaccinate 20 million New Yorkers? It's why not send those doses to the pharmacies that have been in the vaccination business and who presumably aren't overwhelmed. I'm sure it's busier at a CVS or Rite Aid or Walgreens or whatever than it's been, but it's not like running a hospital that's overwhelmed with COVID patients. But the second part of your answer is that I don't think Andrew Cuomo has the ability to say, this didn't work, we're going to try something else. I just don't think he has it in him to say, you know what, my plan's a failure, let's go to plan B. You're not going to hear that from our governor.
And to be totally fair, we're going to talk in a little bit about how folks on the right are also not really able to be accountable to the things that they have very clearly caused as well. So equal blame for the left and the right here on the show. My experience. So like I said, I was quarantined along with my fiance for 10 days, obviously, because, those are the rules. And interestingly enough, just a couple notes here. Contact tracing, there's this flaw that I figured out halfway through my quarantine. Contact tracing, when they call you, they don't give you a callback number. So if you miss their call, you miss their call. So when you get the call from when it says New York State contact tracing on your caller ID, there's no number to call you back. They leave a voicemail, but it's from a phone number that you can't actually call back. So I tried calling that number back and I couldn't get. So I wound up playing phone tag because I didn't test positive. Folks who actually test positive, they are much more aggressive in getting in touch with, and they usually get in touch with them very quickly. But if you're just someone who came into contact with a person who confirmed got the virus, they call you they try to call you every 48 hours until they actually get a hold of you. So my experience was that I actually connected finally with the local health department about 72 hours before my my quarantine period was set to end. Not saying that not saying it's a huge deal. If you come into contact with someone, and she works in healthcare, so it was very easy for us to we had the information, we just quarantined, and that was it. But for the uninitiated, it seems like it would be a pretty sensible thing to have these contact tracers giving a callback number so that they can follow through. And I know the different health departments have been saying, call us within 48 hours if, but me personally, I live in Monroe County, they're swamped. So, I wound up the day before we finally got in touch with Monroe County Health, I wound up leaving a voicemail, and one of the reps wound up leaving me a voicemail. We played phone tag for the last 24 hours before I finally talked to them. It seems like having some sort of digitized system where you could log yourself in would be a fantastic leap forward to making this entire contact tracing process a whole lot easier for everybody.
And there are companies out there who have the expertise to do that. I mean, it could do it quickly. It's... telephone calls are real time. Like you said, you're working at home doing an interview with somebody, and the phone rings and you miss it, and you got no way to get back to them. And here's the other thing. We have this devastated economy and all these people out of work. Why not hire a lot more contact tracers? It doesn't take a great deal of skill or training, I would think, to give someone a list of people and say, here, track all these people down and get their status and figure out where they're at. I mean, it's we just see this again and again and again. We saw it the first time that the state rolled out its new unemployment system. Nobody could get through, and it just was a dismal failure. And yet, there's these companies out here that could do something like that probably in the blink of an eye and have it up and running tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, it just seemed to me like that was probably the last thing of all the things that I was potentially worried about with the quarantine process in terms of how it would play out. That was the last thing on my radar. I wasn't even thinking about that. And then there were some other procedural things that, I'm sure just given the volume of what they're dealing with just aren't important, aspects like incorrect dates on documentation that they're sending to you with an outline of, how long you need to be quarantined for, spoke with the woman on the phone. She says your quarantine is for 10 days because that is the guidance from the state, from your point of contact. And then they send you the documentation, which alleges to be some sort of legal document that you need to sign and return. It says you must quarantine for 14 days. So there's all these and I understand that means they probably just didn't update the PDF that they're sending to people. And I realize that is just not that big a deal in the grand scheme of things, but all of these little
it's just symbolic of the whole system.
Right, exactly. It's all these little clerical errors that just have, the average person pulling their hair out, because supposing you weren't a person who works in healthcare and you had no idea about the system, and you're going days and days without hearing from the person, or hearing from either the person who you came into contact with that they were positive, or the health department or contact tracers, or you're unable to get in contact with them. What are you?
So I'm
you're left
curious,
in this impossible situation.
As somebody that was forced to quarantine, and you live in Monroe County, which is relatively populous, how easy was it to get your test?
Completely easy. It was a matter of just sign up and go. And I don't think,
because my understanding is that that's just still not the case in a lot of places, that there's still a lot of places where people have to either wait or travel some great distance just to get a test.
Well, yeah, and I think part of this is balance, right, between what's available and what the expectation is on the individual. So what do I mean by that? I mean, if your employer wants you to go get a test because you potentially were exposed to somebody, and they don't want you to come to work until you've gotten that test, and where you live only does weekly on-demand COVID testing, and you have to get an appointment, and maybe you were able to get an appointment, maybe you weren't able to get an appointment, then you have to go to an urgent care center if you can't get into one of those county clinics. Testing is readily available, but not at the pace that I think people expect it to be.
Well, and here's another thing I wonder, when you see the governor's backdrop every day for his news conference, it says wear a mask. Second thing is get tested. How many people are getting tested who don't really have any reason that they should be and are clogging up the system? They're getting tested just because, oh my God, I saw on the news how bad it is, I better get tested.
Well, and I'll also say that I don't think that's happening that often because for the most part, insurance providers aren't covering it. So in the private setting, it's just not happening as often as you'd probably imagine, or most people would probably imagine it to be happening. But to that end, the cost is definitely a barrier, in my opinion. I think that there are a lot of people who have just throughout this pandemic, maybe it's not happening as much now, but we definitely saw this through the first 6 to 8 months of the pandemic, where people maybe should have gotten tested, and instead of getting tested, just didn't, because they didn't want to. You're not showing symptoms, don't know if you had direct confirmed contact with someone. Your insurance company is going to turn around and say, we're not covering that. And, depending on where you go, if you go to an urgent care clinic, tests range between $100 and $250, usually towards the top end of that scale. So it's not perfect. But in my experience, looking at this whole thing, having gone through it, I don't necessarily know that the emphasis now should even be on testing. I don't think that the state should be putting any more resources into trying to create more testing methodologies. They should be putting all of their energy and all of their effort into vaccinating.
Well, it's a pretty good point, because, again, in your case, if you don't get any symptoms and the quarantine period runs out, then there's no reason why you shouldn't be free to go about your business. I guess that's a pretty good point.
That's the other thing, too. I want that to be clear. There is no testing requirement to get out of quarantine. You go about your 10 days, you watch your symptoms for the 3 to 4 days.
Well, you do it,
and that's it.
You do it so that you were exposed potentially from your fiance. So you take a test so you can find out if you're positive. Then you got to reach out to your people
Yeah.
Like me coming in here every week and say, well, Ted, I've got it, and you were in the room with me last week, so maybe you better take your precautions.
So here is one of the interesting things that the rep that I wound up talking to in Monroe County told me. If you live with the person who tested positive, you should actually wait until the end of your the very end of your quarantine, which is not what I did, before if you're going to get tested, wait, because if you live with them, you're being exposed in theory,
right,
to some degree over and over and over again throughout that.
And is that being made clear to people?
Yeah, it's great. It's the only thing you can chalk it up to is it's gray area, and it's complicated, and it's impossible to actually navigate perfectly. And frankly, I think, big kudos to the health departments and the people working in healthcare who are dealing with this nightmare of a system day in and day out. Because let me tell you, for all of the people who I see gripe and complain on Twitter that their freedoms are being infringed on and they don't want to have to wear a mask and they want to go about their business, they aren't dealing with half the nightmare that the people who work in healthcare and the people who've gotten COVID are dealing with. So, and
regardless of, I've been critical of the economic shutdowns and I've been critical of the response, but if that's going to help us get rid of it, then just do it. Shut up and wear the mask. I mean, get the stupid vaccine. That's the biggest thing. I don't understand why we're not, I go back to this again and again, but let's make a World War II level, send a man to the moon level commitment to get this done. I mean, back in the 1940s, we enter World War II, we make this mass mobilization of, the men are off fighting, so Rosie the Riveter, the women are recruited into factories and learn how to make battleships. I mean, we can do all that, or we could a generation ago, and today we can't give people shots. I mean, what happened to our ability to just do basic things? Get the shots into people's arms, and then we can be laughing about this at the end of 2021. Hey, remember that time there was COVID? Boy, that sucked.
Well, and plus to that end, I think with the economic restrictions like we've talked about before, we've learned through this pandemic that with proper protocols in place, businesses, restaurants, stores, they aren't the real problem. The real problem are the things that people are doing at home, the parties. And, everybody knows, at this point, everybody knows somebody, whether they admit it or not. Everybody knows somebody who went to a party that they shouldn't have gone to and either had to quarantine or potentially got the virus. And
I did, and I'll admit it, and it was stupid. I didn't get it, but I went to some things that I look back at it and go, what were you thinking?
Yeah.
Why'd that was just dumb.
So, at this point in the game, I think that, and this is where we'll leave this conversation, I think, frankly, it's just time for the state to put all of its eggs in the vaccination basket and move forward. So let's talk about this, what happened in Washington. Obviously, a lot of questions, and I'm not going to get into rehashing. There's plenty of reporting out there if you want to go through and actually read the verbatim breakdown of how it happened and what happened and this, that, and the other thing. But there have been some pretty interesting questions that either have been emailed to us or have popped up in the comments on Facebook or have been sent to us in a message on Facebook or Twitter. I think some of these warrant discussion, and I think the others are just interesting topics for the show. So we'll get into them here. First things first, the easy one, I think, is the easier question. Should Donald Trump be removed from office at this point, even though he's, quote unquote, issued a concession, even though I don't really understand what the point of this concession was other than to just make peace at a time when he completely flipped the country upside down?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the reason is because what happens increasingly is our higher-ups get away with this behavior, and if there's no punishment and no accountability, what's to stop the next person? I mean, Congressman Chris Collins goes to jail for financial wrongdoings, gets pardoned, and he's out. That tells me if I'm Congressman X in the future, I don't have to worry because they're not going to get me. And if they do, I'll get pardoned. So I think it's important that there be punishment and accountability so that the next person who wants to do these things thinks twice and doesn't do it. That's the whole reason we have a criminal system and fines and jails, is to make other people go, whoa, look what happens if you do that.
Yeah, and I would simply add to that I think Congress should go through the steps. Congress should go through the actual impeachment steps again if they feel like they can get it done in the next, what is now 12 or 13 days.
And I do say I favor impeachment over the 25th Amendment because
Correct.
Impeachment carries with it a ban from further office in the United States. That would end any Trump 2024. That would be the end of it. He would not be eligible. Now, would he still run anyway? Could be.
Yep.
But constitutionally, he'd be ineligible to serve again.
So this next one is a two-parter. Where does the GOP go from here, and what about politics in general? Do you think this will change at all? Because this is something that I've also been thinking about. Does this change sort of the spectrum in any way, shape, or form of what people consider to be right, left, center, far left, far right? Does this change that spectrum at all, given the scope of what happened this week?
I'm going to be the cynic here and say probably not. I think there's going to be a lot of reexamination within the Republican Party. There might become a more reasonable wing of the Republican Party that says, let's make sure that we don't nominate a guy like this again. Because if you remember, nobody wanted Donald Trump when this started. He was in 17th place or something out of 17. He just figured out how to connect directly with voters who had certain economic grievances, like you talked about, and he figured out how to kind of go around the powers within the party and kind of appeal directly to these voters and get himself elected. So I think that as long as we have this bubble where the left gets its information from one place and the right gets it from another, and we can't even agree on basic truths, it's going to be hard to affect any change. Already we're seeing right-wing media. Sinclair Television sent out a package to its 100-plus affiliates across the country saying that this was the work of Antifa. Right-wing talk, including on my own station, is insinuating that these weren't really Trump supporters. They weren't real Republicans. They were provocateurs. Rush, well, not Rush because he's off, I think. He's still got a host on, and God bless Rush and hope he regains his health, although the prognosis isn't good for him. It's just, I see a lack of a lot of people on the right taking ownership and saying, yeah, this was us, and it wasn't right, and it can't happen again. So, short answer, I don't see any great big change happening. I guess there'll be, we certainly have a good chance to find out because now we have a Democratic administration coming in and nominally a Democratic Senate. Everybody keeps saying, oh, the Democrats have the Senate, but remember, one senator defects and they don't have it. Mm-hmm. So people like Joe Manchin are going to get a whole bunch of camera time going forward, and everybody's going to want to know what he thinks. Because all these kind of right-leaning Democrats, any one of them breaks away, and you don't have control. So anyway, I'm rambling here, but what will the Biden administration be allowed to do? Will Republicans relentlessly obstruct his cabinet nominees, or will they say, okay, let's let him through? I think that's where the rubber hits the road. It's because it's all part of the same package, the obstructionism, the refusal to allow Obama to have a Supreme Court nominee, the idea that Democrats winning elections just isn't legitimate.
Yeah, I think when I look at this, the thing that sticks out to me is that it feels like we're back to the quote-unquote Tea Party era, where you have a faction of the Republican Party that feels one way, and then you've got a more moderate pack of the Republican Party that feels another way. Which is larger, which is smaller? I think right now that the larger pack by a long shot is the moderate group. And I don't know how the Trump base, whatever that is. I don't know how that base can get strong enough footing in the next at least in the next 2 years, to have any big impact on policy. Because I think at the end of the day, the Mitch McConnells, the people who frankly now have established themselves as true establishment Republicans, especially in the eyes of the Republican base, if we're going to argue that the Republican base is really far out there to the right, I mean, they're not going to gain anything by going back and trying to, extend an olive branch by voting against a cabinet nomination or voting against some policy that these people just clearly don't care about. They've already committed the worst offense in their eyes that they could have done, which is go against Donald Trump.
Well, and I think that a lot of it depends on what the president does when he becomes the former president. He issued a statement. I don't know how sincere he was, but for the first time ever, he condemned these people. He said, this isn't right. We'll come punish you. I hope he means that. He has committed to a peaceful transfer of power. I hope he means that. Because what has kept a lot of Republican politicians from calling out Donald Trump is fear of a primary challenge from a man. Donald Trump can raise tens of millions of dollars as ex-president if he chooses, and he can put that money into primary challenges for anyone who goes against him. That's why a lot of the Republicans in Congress have been afraid to even admit that Joe Biden won the election, is out of fear of having a very well-funded Donald Trump-backed primary opponent the next time they have to run.
Yeah, and just a footnote, because I don't want to give this too much attention, but the idea that Antifa was somehow responsible for what happened this week at the Capitol is just outright lunacy. If you think that, you're not an intelligent person. I'll just say that. I mean, there is. I tweeted this a few days ago. It defies the logic, and it defies what we all watched play out in real time. It defies both of those things. It defies
Having
the
said
truth.
that, I don't know whose poll it was, but there was a poll, and obviously a pretty instant one. I think it was the day after what happened. 45% of Republicans that they polled approved of what happened at the Capitol.
Right, which is complete crap. I don't take any more stock in those polls than I do election polls or anything else. I mean, it means absolutely nothing. Because when you think about that, where do you think that poll appeared? That poll probably appeared on Newsmax or probably appeared on one of these right-wing conspiracy websites.
Could be, and I apologize because I don't know exactly which poll it was or how. And legit.
I'm not poo-pooing it. I'm just saying, like, we're seeing these kinds of messages be pushed all the time. It's like when Senator Cruz was talking through his objections to the vote count. He is citing all of these percentages of people who didn't think the election was legit or think that it was stolen and yada yada. And it's like, I literally was talking to my friend. I said he could have plugged in any numbers he wanted to there. It's never going to be fact checked, and there's probably a poll somewhere that says it. Doesn't mean it's legit. Doesn't mean it means anything. So anyway, this is one that's interesting to me. Should we be concerned that post-election pressure to change outcomes of races will stick? Because it seems like we are in this weird place where we've seen different political actors over the last 2 months try to change the outcome of the election, which by all legitimate accounts was a legitimate election. And it seems like that might be one of the things that could stick moving forward, especially given what some in Congress were saying when the objections were happening, that they were worried that the process that was playing out on Wednesday could become an every 4-year process where suddenly this thing that Congress did before that never mattered suddenly matters and is part of the election process, in that it actually contributes to who is going to be the next president.
I believe it absolutely will happen. I believe if Joe Biden is reelected in 4 years and it's in any way close at all, it'll be challenged. My understanding is that this race, even though Biden won by 7 million total popular votes, in the 3 or 4 battleground states, his victory was actually closer than Donald Trump's was in 2016. It would not have taken very many votes changed or tallies changed to have flipped that election. And also keep in mind that President Trump's legal effort to overturn the election was comically inept, led by the comically inept Rudy Giuliani. Imagine a smarter guy with smarter lawyers and 4 years to raise money to get ready for this. I again, being the cynic here, but I don't see any way that we don't see this happen. I think the next time that there's a Democratic president and a Republican-controlled Congress, that president will immediately be impeached for whatever reason that they can come up with.
Yeah.
I think, and that's the polarization that led to what happened at the Capitol. That's all part of it, in my opinion. And that's what I'm going to keep a really close eye on in the Joe Biden administration. That's why I say you might not think, what does approving cabinet nominees have to do with this? But it would show a good faith effort on the part of Republicans to let Democrats govern when they win and to just admit it when they win and do what we've done for centuries, which is say, okay, our side lost, we'll try to work with them, and we'll try harder next time in 2 or 4 years.
Yeah, and I think the next question that I wanted to touch on was something that I mentioned to you this morning on your show, which is, should local elected officials who have been perpetuating misinformation or the ramblings that appear online on these right-wing conspiracy theory websites, should those individuals be held accountable for perpetuating that misinformation?
I think they should. And I think they should be called out by people higher up the food chain. I mean, Congressman Reed crossed over to the Democratic side of the aisle and made a very impassioned speech the other day. So I think it's up to him now and to Congressman Katko to keep saying those things. And I'd love to see them publicly call out people spreading this misinformation and say, you got to stop this. This isn't who we are as a party. This isn't who we want to be. And this isn't who you should be.
Yeah, and to that end, I mean, it's interesting because for a lot of the people who I'm seeing spread that misinformation online, they have been longtime towers of the party line. They are the people who have been most dedicated to the Republican Party in the last 20 years, and it will be the end of the Republican Party, especially in these small rural communities where you're hanging on by a thread as it is, because any kind of like organized effort is just very difficult to come by in these, especially in politics, these small communities.
And the Republicans face, don't forget, a demographic challenge in the years to come. The people that make up their base are becoming a smaller percentage of America, and the people that make up the Democratic base are becoming a growing percentage. That's why we have a president who wins by 7 million votes, but we're on pins and needles to see. I mean, that's just the way our electoral college system works. So at some point, Republicans are going to have to broaden their appeal, I think, to more people, or they're going to start losing an awful lot of presidential elections and congressional elections too.
Yeah, and I want to sort of close out here with just what's your takeaway? Like, what is the thing that you're thinking about as we move forward toward inauguration, and then obviously past inauguration? What is the one thing that you're sort of left with after all of this is played out?
Well, I guess, and again, I tend to lean mostly left in my politics, but I'm just watching to see if all these people who passionately denounced all of this will continue to passionately denounce it when it pops up in the future. And again, not just the acts that we saw at the Capitol, but the policies and the politics that inevitably led to those things. I mean, I kept hearing the word shocked the other day, and I kept saying to myself, why is anybody shocked? We should have seen this coming for a long time. And there have been people who've been warning. There were people who warned the day Donald Trump became president that we'd see something like this. So that's what my takeaway is. Let's see if this unprecedented effort to really tear at the foundation of our country, if it's really not going to be tolerated anymore, or if we're going to forget and see the same thing happen in some other venue. I mean, we'll find out as soon as the 20th for the inauguration. Are we going to have marching yahoos with rifles strapped over their shoulders at a presidential inauguration?
Yeah, and remains to be seen. The thing that I've been left with throughout this entire mess has been that at the end of the day, people genuinely misunderstand how similar the disadvantaged folks on both sides of the political spectrum actually are, whether it be in terms of how they're educated by their party, in terms of policy and what the different policies mean, not just for them, but for the people that they see on the other side of the aisle. And then also just how, if you look at, on the economic side, if you look at how poor people on one side of the aisle look at folks on the other side, particularly those who are also economically disadvantaged, and they view them as pawns to their party, as pawns to their, and it's this catch-22 or contradiction or whatever you want to call it. Like, it's the same thing happening in both arenas. And until we correct the inequity that exists in this country, and don't say that it doesn't exist, because simply working hard doesn't get the job done anymore. Hasn't in a long time. We're going to keep seeing things like this happen. We're going to keep seeing people like Donald Trump, or frankly any other polarizing political figure who can say the right words at the right time, drum up this kind of like seriously kinetic energy that can explode. And like it did this week, it can explode. And you know, that it's just, there are core problems that, you know, some politicians have been talking about, but unfortunately not enough of them. And I hope after the 20th we can start to see more of these conversations actually happen, and maybe even some meaningful policy to boot. Well,
you're absolutely right, and I wish I could remember who it was who said it. Someone said that the real divide in our country is not left-right, it's top-bottom. Mm-hmm. And it really is.
Yes, it is. And where can folks listen to you Monday through Friday?
I'm on the Finger Lakes Morning News on Finger Lakes News Radio. In Auburn, that's 98.1 and 1590 WAUB. In Geneva, it's 106.3 and 1240 WGVA.
All right, that's it. We will be back next week. The Weekend Debrief is a production of FL1 Digital Media. Check the show out on Spotify or wherever you get podcasts. Have a question for us? Email it to debrief@fingerlakes1.com. You can also check out our daily debrief, which is a shortened version of this podcast, where we dive into local issues and headlines with the people behind them. Check that out by visiting fingerlakes1.com/daily. You can also find those episodes in this very feed on Spotify, Anchor, or Apple Podcasts, wherever you are listening from. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time.